Let me start with a warning. This episode isn't just about the past, it's about the lies we're still telling today. The ones that keep getting people killed. Just this weekend in Minnesota, lawmakers were shot. And it wasn't random. It wasn't just some senseless act. It happened because a man believed a lie, a conspiracy theory fed to him over months by angry voices online and on TV. And he was convinced it was true. And people paid the price. And this is what happens when lies go unchecked. When fear turns into policy. When propaganda turns into violence. And no, this didn't just start with Trump. It didn't start with Facebook or QAnon or any of those. It started long before all of that. When politicians realized something simple. You don't have to solve poverty if you can just blame poor people for being poor. So they created a villain. Not the rich, not the big corporations, not the banks or billionaires dodging taxes. No. They started with a black woman in a Cadillac. And they call her a welfare queen. And they say she was scamming the system, living large, taking your tax dollars and laughing about it. And you heard the story. We all have. But here's the truth. That woman, she wasn't real. Her name was Linda Taylor. And yeah, she committed fraud. But the story they told about her, that was a lie. A lie they used to turn the country against poor people, to gut social programs, to make it harder for families to get help. And that lie, it's still around. You can hear it in the way people talk about food stamps, in the way we treat folks living on the edge, and how we criminalize being poor, especially if you're black or brown. So today we're digging into the truth behind the welfare queen myth, how it started, why it stuck, and how it's still hurting people today, through policy, through politics, and through plain old hate. Because once you make up a villain like that, you never stop looking for someone else to blame. This is The Problem With, The Lies We Tell, and today we're talking about the lie that turned poverty into a crime.
The stereotype of the so-called welfare queen has been used to demonize those on public assistance for decades. It's a politically potent image depicting an undeserving aid recipient getting rich on the backs of taxpayers. Politicians, including former President Ronald Reagan, have been accused of exploiting this image as a kind of racist dog whistle. Meanwhile, the original welfare queen that Reagan used as a basis for his caricature was based on a real person. The new book, The Queen, tells the story of a woman who went by many names, was accused of many crimes, and whose image as a Cadillac-driving welfare recipient has lived on. Hari Srinivasan recently spoke with the book's author, Josh Levine, about the real-life woman behind the moniker.
Her name was Linda Taylor, and she was identified by the Chicago Tribune in 1974 as a person who had committed welfare fraud while driving fancy cars, including a Cadillac. And very quickly after that, she was given the nickname the Welfare Queen. And it was a nickname and a stereotype that really very quickly blew up.
You know, it was a Chicago paper that gave her that nickname, but it's really Ronald Reagan on the campaign trail that makes that phrase such a household idea. How did it get from the Chicago paper into his speeches?
Reagan was looking for kind of outrageous stories about welfare. And this idea that there were welfare cheats out there was something that created outrage.
So before we get to what we call the welfare queen, let's go back even before whatever they called it today, the welfare queen. How do we get to there? So let's start, like, before Ronald Reagan ever said the words welfare queen, before America imagined her as a black woman draped in fur behind a wheel of a Cadillac with a dozen fake names and a wallet full of stolen Social Security cards, this lie had already been written. To see where it starts, we have to rewind back to the early 1960s, back to the Jim Crow South, where racism wasn't subtle, it was the law. And right there in Arkansas, in Louisiana, is where the seeds of the quote-unquote welfare queen myth were planted. And they're not by accident, not by some misunderstanding, but on purpose, with strategy, with cruelty, and with cameras ready. Let me introduce you to something called the reverse freedom rides. Yeah, not the freedom rides that we all know that we learn about in history class. Not the brave black and white activists risking their lives to integrate bus across the South. No. These were reverse freedom rides, a stunt pulled by white supremacists to mock the civil rights movement. In 1962, White Citizens Council, basically the respectable face of the Klan, started putting poor black families on buses, shipping them north. Places like New York City, Chicago, even Massachusetts. They promised them jobs, they promised them housing, they promised them opportunity. But there was no jobs, no housing, just no opportunity, just lies. And these families, many of them single black mothers, they were set up. And the real plan? To humiliate the North, to catch liberal politicians flat-footed, to make them look like fools for preaching equality while struggling to deal with poverty in their own backyards. Hey, guess what? That sounds familiar. Remember when Greg Abbott and DeSantis sent a lot of immigrants to Martha's Vineyard? Same situation, different demographic now. When buses arrive, reporters were already there, tipped off by the very people who organized the stunts. Cameras roll, flash rolls popped, and the images that follow were exactly what those white supremacists wanted. Black women with children in need. And turned into a political props. The message was loud and clear. And I quote, "Look at what happens when you help those people. This is what welfare gets you." This was writer Josh Levin said it best in The Atlantic, and I quote again, "These stunts serve a political theater aimed at turning the moral high ground of civil rights into a punchline and black poverty into a threat." And it worked. Those images fed into a rising wave of media coverage and so-called welfare fraud. In 1965, Reader's Digest, which was practically on every middle-class coffee table in America, ran a piece titled "The Mind of the Welfare Chiseler." In it, they wrote, and I quote, "The average welfare family knows more about how to work the system than the average caseworker." There was no evidence, no data, just vibes, and those vibes were racist as hell. But they resonated. White Americans, already anxious about the changing racial landscape of the country, wanted someone to blame. And blaming the poor, especially poor black people, was a lot easier than confronting systems of inequality. It wasn't the factory shutting down, or wages stagnating, or wealth hoard at the top. No. It was them, the people on welfare, getting the free stuff. By the late 60s, this narrative had real momentum. And it wasn't just coming from tabloids or French groups. Politicians picked it up, gave it a microphone, and used it as a weapon. As more black women entered the welfare system, not because they were lazy, but because the economy had left them behind, and the white backlash exploded at that time. So historian Premilia Nadesing explains, and I quote, "Once welfare became associated with black women, it was no longer viewed as a safety net for the needy, but as a system of abuse and dependency." That's the moment everything shifted. Welfare, which had been seen as a public good when white families dominated the roles, was now painted as a scam, something to be ashamed of. And poverty, that wasn't seen as a crisis. It was painted as a moral failure. So by the time Ronald Reagan took the stage in 1976 and told a story about a woman with 80 aliases and a Cadillac, he didn't have to do much work. The audience already believed it. He just gave the myth a name. He gave it swagger. He gave it a villain with a face. But the lie? That was the years in the making. It was rehearsed, scripted, and staged, all to justify punishing the poor while letting the rich off the hook. So no, the welfare queen wasn't just a racist dog whistle. She was a political strategy, she was media bait, she was a scapegoat created to shift blame away from systems and towards individuals. And the script? It's still being used today. But we just changed the names and the demographics, or we still use the same demographics. You probably have heard it, and we still say it to this day.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
So let's start with who they say is the welfare queen. Like, her name was Linda Taylor. But chances are you don't know her by that name. You know her by a title, a nickname that became a slur, a stereotype, and a political tool. It was the welfare queen. That's what Ronald Reagan called her. And that's how millions of Americans came to know her. And let's be clear right from the jump. Yes, Linda Taylor committed welfare fraud. That part is true. She lied about her identity. She collected multiple checks. She broke the law. But here's the thing that they don't want to talk about. That's not the story Reagan told. Because what Linda Taylor actually did and what she got turned into are two very different things. So let's start. In 1974, a reporter named George Bliss from the Chicago Tribune wrote a story about a mysterious woman suspected of using multiple names to collect government benefits. He didn't name her Welfare Queen. That title came later, but he painted the picture. A woman dressed in furs, driving a Cadillac, bouncing between addresses. She sounded like a criminal mastermind, a villain straight out of a movie. And then Reagan picked it up and ran with it. While campaigning for president in 1976, he stood on stages across America, especially in cities with racial tensions bubbling just beneath the surface, and told this story, and I quote, "There's a woman in Chicago. She has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards. She's collecting veteran benefits on 4 non-existent deceased husbands, and she is collecting welfare under each of her names. Her tax-free income is over $150,000 a year." That's a direct quote he said in Southside Chicago, where racial tensions were already high. And then he said it again in Des Moines, then in Sacramento, then in Detroit, over and over. The crowds loved it, reporters repeated it, and pretty soon, Linda Taylor was national news without her name ever being spoken. But here's what court records actually show. Linda Taylor was charged with defrauding the government out of about $8,000, not $150,000, not with 80 aliases, not some grand criminal empire, just a woman who scammed the system like plenty of white folks did at the time too, but without the media circus. She wasn't even the biggest welfare fraud case in Chicago. She was just the one with a Cadillac and a profile that made her an easy target. As Josh Levin wrote in his book, The Queen, and I quote, "She was a con artist, yes, but also a scapegoat. Her crimes extended well beyond welfare, but no one cared about that. What Reagan needed was a symbol, a face to attach to the narrative of government waste." And that's what she became. Never mind the rumors that she may have been involved in kidnappings, identity theft, and insurance fraud. None of that made headlines. What made headlines was the myth that a black woman was getting rich off your tax dollars, that she was laughing while you worked. It didn't matter if it was true. It felt true, and that was enough. And Reagan used it like a weapon. He didn't need to show a photo. He didn't need a conviction record. All he needed was a story that sounded like something white middle-class America already believed, and it worked. The damage didn't stop with Linda Taylor. Her myth helped launch a full-on political shift. It reshaped how Americans view welfare, not as a lifeline for families in need, but as a loophole for lazy people. Not as a tool to fight poverty, but as something that needed to be policed and punished. And it was no accident that she was portrayed as a black woman. As historian Mary Frances Berry put it, and I quote, "She was used to take the anger Americans felt about the economy and redirect it towards poor black women." Linda Taylor wasn't the problem, but she became the perfect excuse. Because once she existed in the public imagination, even as a caricature, politicians didn't need to argue about poverty anymore. They just needed to say, "welfare queen," and watch voters nod along. It didn't matter what the truth was. It never really did.
Many of the incoming Republican candidates said that they were against wasteful government spending and federal subsidies. Are you ready to be shocked? It turns out a lot of them get those same exact subsidies. Oh my God, I didn't see that coming. Republican Vicky Hartzler of Missouri has received more than $770,000 in farm subsidies over the last 15 years. The incoming Congresswoman justified receiving this form of welfare by saying protecting farmers is a national security issue. Oh, please. Now, Uber Republican Michelle Bachmann's family has received over $250,000 in the last 15 years for the Bachmann family farm in the ironically named Independence, Wisconsin. South Dakota Republican Kristi Noem has received more than $3 million in subsidies over the last 15 years. And incoming Republican Congressman Stephen Fincher's family has received a whopping $3.2 million in farm subsidies over the last 10 years. Are these the new welfare queens? Because there isn't a welfare recipient in the country that I know of that's ever gotten anywhere near this kind of money from the federal government.
So, what happens when a lie gets repeated enough? It becomes truth. Not in reality, but in policy. And you probably have heard this a lot, like someone lies to you so much, or even yourself, you lie about something so much that eventually you believe it yourself. So that's just what happened. And that's exactly what happened with the welfare queen myth. After Ronald Reagan told the story of Linda Taylor enough times at rallies, interviews, and speeches across the country, she stopped being a person. She became a template, a blueprint for a narrative that will define poverty in America for the next 40 years. And once that story took hold, it didn't just shape opinions, it shaped law. So let's start in 1981, just months after Reagan took office. That's when he pushed through the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. That sounds very boring, right? Just some government finance jargon. But, well, here's what it really did. It cut $1.5 billion from food stamps. It slashed aid to families with dependent children, AFDC, by 13%. Reduced federal support for subsidized childcare. It tightened eligibility rules across the board. And what did Reagan say this was about? It was about, and I quote, stopping fraud and abuse. I can't do Ronald Reagan, sorry guys. And he didn't need he didn't need data. He didn't need proof. He had the myth, he had Linda Taylor, and the public believed him. But the truth? The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, reviewed welfare spending at the time. They found that fraud made up less than 1% of total welfare cost. Let me say that again, less than 1%. Meaning 99% of the money was helping people exactly the way it was supposed to. But facts didn't matter anymore. Because once people believed the system was broken, once they believed poor people were lazy or dishonest, every cut looked like fiscal responsibility. Every restriction looked like accountability. Even if it hurt children, even if it pushed single moms into homelessness, even if it destroyed lives. And here's the thing. It wasn't just Reagan. This wasn't just the Republican story. Let's fast forward 15 years to 1996. And who's in the White House? Bill Clinton, a Democrat, the so-called president of the third way. And what does he do? He signs the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Catchy, right? Again, it's just try to say that 20 times in a row this time. It replaced AFDC, the core of America's welfare safety net, with TANF or TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. It sounds like a refresh, but it wasn't just a rebrand. It was a complete rewrite. TANF added time limits, no more than 5 years on aid, total, for your entire life. It added work requirements, meaning you had to prove you were working, looking for work, or in job training to feed your kids. And it gave states block grants so they could decide how much help you got or didn't get. And states, they used that freedom to slash benefits even further. Some used TANF money to fund marriage counseling programs instead of food assistance. Others use it for abstinence-only education. In Tennessee, by the early 2000s, they were spending TANF funds on college scholarships for middle-class students instead of poor families in crisis. That's not just bad policy, that's theft. And while this was happening, Clinton bragged, and I quote, "The era of big government is over." This was Bill Clinton, 1996, his State of the Union. What he really meant, the era of big help is over. From that point forward, welfare didn't just shrink, it was shame. It wasn't a support system, it was a trap. Something you were supposed to escape as fast as possible or never touch at all. So here are the numbers. In 1996, the year Clinton signed that bill, 68 out of every 100 families living in poverty received cash assistance. By 2019, that number dropped to just 23 out of 100. Not because poverty disappeared, not because people suddenly got jobs, but because the system stopped helping. Because the myth told us that most people on welfare were scammers. That lie didn't just rewrite the law, it rewired our culture. If you grew up in the 90s or early 2000s, you remember the jokes. Comedians made fun of the welfare moms. TV shows show poor families on chaotic or dishonest. Politicians on both sides use phrases like deadbeat dads and personal responsibility to deflect from the real issue. It's like, why were so many people poor in the first place? What happened to good jobs, to affordable housing, to wages that could actually support the family? Reagan never answered those questions. Clinton didn't either. Because by then, the myth has done its job. As legal scholar Dorothy Roberts wrote, and I quote, "The welfare queen myth wasn't just racist. It redefined poor black mothers as the problem, not poverty itself. Once the belief took hold, reforms stopped being about lifting people up. They became about pushing people off the rolls." And that's exactly what happened. Not just in the 1980s, not just in the 90s, but for the next 3 decades and counting.
Do government assistance programs need tighter restrictions? We're asking because the Trump administration has just approved a stricter rule that will affect who can receive food stamps under the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or better known as SNAP. So now, take a look at this. Under current law, able-bodied adults ages 18 to 49 with no dependents cannot receive benefits for more than 3 months over a 3-year period unless they are working or enrolled in an education program for 80 hours a month. States have been able to get around that time requirement with waivers, but the new rule, which takes effect next April, clamps down on many exemptions. Also, the USDA estimates 688,000 people will lose benefits. That's nearly the population of Mesa and Tempe combined. And this new rule is just part one of a 3-step process. By the time it's entirely rolled out, nearly 4 million people could lose their benefits, according to analysis by the Urban Institute. So what does that mean? This will save the government and taxpayers $5.5 billion over the next 5 years. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue says the goal is to move food stamp recipients toward, quote, self-sufficiency and into employment. However, it does seem like a strong economy is already helping with that. As of August, 1.7 million fewer people received food stamps than last year. Even still, 36.4 million people, more than 1 in 10 in the U.S., receive food stamps. Thousands of people facing food insecurity in our state rely on other resources for help, like food banks. We asked the folks over at St. Vincent de Paul how these new regulations will impact those families. Here's Mary Chow Thompson.
When I hear about these cuts, I think about the families that come to our dining room who are trying to make ends meet. A lot of them have jobs, have multiple jobs that might be just paying minimum wage, and they're trying to get by. And so they might be faced with a decision of paying a bill to keep a roof over their head, or keeping the lights on, or paying for food. And that's where we come in, to make sure that they're not on the streets with their children and that they can still go on and provide for their families.
The changes will not go into effect until April 1st, 2020.
Now, this wasn't just policy that cemented the welfare queen myth. It was also pop culture. TV shows, stand-up specials, talk shows, movies, even rap lyrics in the 90s, they all echoed the same stereotype. A black woman, 5 kids, government checks rolling in, no job, no shame, loud, rude, lazy, and always the punchline. And you guys have heard this before. You guys have heard the ratchet and all that stuff from people saying about black women. And that's the problem. Like, they're saying the same things, but we have evolved the language. But let's go back. Let's pause and ask, why her? Why Linda Taylor? Why was she named the symbol of everything wrong with the economy? Why not Wall Street bankers? Why not corrupt politicians? Why not the actual companies outsourcing jobs and dodging taxes? Because this was never about truth. It was never about numbers. It was about blame. It was about scapegoating. And it was about who this country was willing to point the finger at. The myth stuck because it fit the script America knew by heart. It wasn't enough that she was poor. She was black, check. A woman, check. Sexually irresponsible, check. And supposedly gaming the system at the expense of decent, hardworking, read white taxpayers, check. It was racism, it was misogyny, and it was sold as entertainment. Sociologist Patricia Hill Collins explains it better in Black Feminist Thought. And I quote, "The welfare queen is one of many controlling images that serve to justify black women's oppression, especially those who challenge traditional gender roles. Because the truth is, the welfare queen wasn't just a political myth. She became a cultural export, a stock character, a lazy mother, a loudmouth and a joke. And once that image made its way into comedy, it became damn near impossible to separate truth from parody. Think about the 90s. Characters like Shaheen Jenkins on Martin. I'm sorry, I don't know if but anyways, you know who I'm talking about. Exaggerated, neck rolling, gum popping, or the quote-unquote ghetto baby mamas in movies like Don't Be a Menace to South Central Willie while drinking your juice in the hood. Literally a parody, but one that confirmed people's worst assumptions. It's like even Mad TV had Bon Quickie, a stereotype over-the-top working-class black woman played for cheap laughs. None of this was subtle. It was coded. It was familiar. And it was funny because the audience had already been trained to see it as truth. To laugh at poverty, to mock poor mothers, to believe that welfare was just a hustle. And it wasn't just comedy. In 1994, Time magazine dropped one of the most offensive welfare covers in history. The headline, "Who Gets What?" The image, a black woman in hair curlers holding a baby in one arm and foot stamps in the other. Standing behind her, a frustrated white man in a suit holding a briefcase, clearly the taxpayer. The message wasn't subtle. Black woman equals taker, white man equals victim. And this was Time magazine, not a tabloid. The subtext became national conscious. Welfare is broken, welfare is unfair, welfare is their fault. Even Oprah, who did plenty of good with her platform, aired segments in the early 2000s about welfare abuse, but the focus was always the extreme cases. The woman who lied about her income, the one who bought luxury items with EBT, the exception, not the rule. And every time those stories air, the public belief in the myth got stronger. Meanwhile, the truth, it never got airtime. Here's what the actual data said. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services, most people on welfare have children. The majority use it temporarily, less than 2 years, and the largest racial group receiving food assistance, here it is, ready folks? White Americans, every single year. But fact don't sell headlines. Nuance doesn't fit into a punchline, and data doesn't get laughs at open mic night. Because here's the hard truth. The public didn't want a complex story. They wanted a villain. They wanted someone to hate. And politicians, along with the media, handed them one. A woman who was black, a woman who was poor, a woman who didn't know her place. And that image has been hard to kill because it's been repackaged over and over and over again for decades. Sometimes in a meme, sometimes in a TV show, sometimes behind a politician's smile. And every time it's repeated, it becomes a little harder to see the truth behind it.
The welfare queen image is a manufacture of Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party using only one story from Chicago in the 1970s of one woman who scammed something from the system, and it's not entirely clear all that she scammed.
There's this notion that 99% of the welfare money in this society is going to Black and Hispanics. It's wrong, it's bogus, because the majority of people on welfare are white. The majority of people on food stamps are white.
So let's fast forward now. So current, here we are, decades later in the 2020s. Reagan's dead, Clinton's retired, allegedly. Pretty sure he's still doing stuff. And Linda Taylor, she's been long gone. But the welfare queen, that myth, she's still here, still showing up. It's just wearing new disguises. You hear her every time someone says, well, lazy people just want handouts. You see her in state laws that force people to pee in a cup just to eat. You feel her in the quiet shame folks carry when they swipe an EBT card at a grocery store, looking over the shoulder like they've done something wrong. She never left, and she just evolved. Again, I'm gonna keep talking facts, and I source all these stuff, man. I know I get pushback from people saying how dare you say this. I research these things, guys. This is all research improved stuff. Again, let's talk facts, because this is where the myth really falls apart. Despite decades of racist imagery, false political ads, and clickbait headlines, the reality is white Americans make up the largest group of welfare recipients in the United States. And don't give me this crap about white make more what's the percentage of the country. Okay, but at the same time, you're making the majority of something that you that you make terrible. You're demonized. So here, what's the problem here? And according to the U.S. Departments of Agriculture and the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities, over 36% of SNAP recipients, the food stamps program, are white. About 25% are Black, 17% Latino, and the rest, Asian, Indigenous, or other groups, all fall or far smaller shares. So why does the face of welfare in memes, in debates, and campaign attack ads still look like a black woman in curls holding a baby? Because the life was never about being accurate. It was about being useful. It was about blame. And that blame still works like a charm. Look around at modern politics. We don't have to really just go to a history book. We see it every day. If you red states, the ones that rail against government handouts, They're often the most dependent on federal assistance. States like Mississippi, West Virginia, Kentucky, where poverty is high and jobs are scarce, take more from Washington than they give. But instead of demanding better infrastructure, healthcare, and schools, many voters in those states have been convinced to vote against their own survival. Why? Because they've been taught that the problem is someone else. Not Wall Street, not the billionaires next door, not the corporations sending jobs overseas. Nope. It's the black mom in Chicago, the immigrant family in Texas, the young kid in a hoodie buying hot Cheetos with food stamps. And that's the genius and the cruelty of the myth. It turns neighbors into enemies. It turns survival into shame. It turns poverty into a moral failure instead of policy choice. And let's be real, the blame game, it wins elections. It builds outrage. It fills airtime. It keeps the poor fighting each other while the rich laugh all the way to the bank. So instead of asking, why does insulin cost $300 a vial? Why does college bury people in debt for life? Why are workers still making $7.25 an hour while CEOs fly private? We're still stuck asking, who's cheating the system? That's not just a distraction. That's the point. Because the welfare queen myth was never just a stereotype. It was a weapon used to justify cutting food stamps, used to block universal health care, used to criminalize poverty, used to shame people into silence. And today, she's still being used, just with a new coat of paint. We shame single moms for asking for help. We attack immigrants for sending money back to their families. We mock Gen Z for juggling gig jobs and still needing roommates. And all the while, billionaires park yachts in international waters to avoid taxes, and no one calls them lazy. Let's call it what it is. Welfare shaming is class warfare, wrapped in a flag and sold as morality. It's a con, a cover story, a distraction from the real theft, the kind done in boardrooms and tax loopholes, not food stamps offices. So, I'm gonna do a final thought before the recap. The welfare queen was never real. She was a story, a distraction, a scapegoat designed to make Americans punch down instead of looking up. She taught us to turn poverty into a punchline, to treat help like a crime, to believe that struggling people were the enemy, instead of asking why so many of us are struggling in the first place. So maybe it's time to stop asking who's cheating the system and start asking who built a system that needs to be cheated just to survive. Before we close out, let me make one thing real clear for everyone. We don't deal in fiction on this show. We deal in facts, receipts, history. But yeah, I get very emotional because how could we not? I mean, we're tired, and if you're listening to this, you probably are too. Tired of watching the government treat poverty like a personality flaw. Tired of hearing politicians, mostly white, mostly Republican, tell working class voters to tighten their belts while handing tax breaks to billionaires. And tired of seeing single moms demonized for needing help, while Fortune 500 companies pay $0 in taxes and get bailouts when they screw up. And I'm tired of watching people struggle and get blamed for it. This isn't just frustrating. It's dangerous because lies don't just sit in history books. They don't stay behind podiums or in campaign ads. Lies become policy. Lies become belief. Lies become violence. And we're living in that violence right now. We've seen a surge in political attacks fueled by conspiracy theories and economic fear. And yes, by racism. Charlottesville wasn't random. January 6th wasn't random. Mass shootings at grocery stores, churches, and schools aren't just senseless tragedies. They are the outcome of a playbook that has been running for decades. A playbook that tells angry people, you're not broke because the system's rigged, you're broke because they took it from you. And they is always someone vulnerable. Black folks, immigrants, refugees, single moms, LGBTQ kids, anyone who looks or lives outside the status quo. It's the same lie. It's just with a different headline. And the welfare queen, she was one of the first. She taught America how to blame the poor instead of the powerful. She became the blueprint for every scapegoat to follow. And that blueprint still works. But here's the truth. Poverty isn't a crime. Needing help isn't weakness. And telling the truth loudly, clearly, and unapologetically isn't radical. It's necessary. So if you ever needed help, if you ever stood in line at a government's office, if you ever felt that knot in your stomach before swiping a benefits card, if you ever been called lazy, worthless, or a burden, you are none of those things. The system failed you, not the other way around, and you don't owe anyone an apology for surviving. And here's the part they don't want us to realize. When we tell the truth, when we name the lie, when we talk to each other, not past each other, we break that spell. Because the lie only works when we stay quiet. It only survives when we're too ashamed to speak. And it only wins when we're too divided to fight back. So we need to keep going. We need to still fight for the truth. So I would like for y'all to share this episode, talk to your people, call out the myth. If you didn't know about the welfare queen, because I've asked people that I know, it's like, hey, can you say what the welfare queen is? What does it mean? And they exactly told me what the propaganda said. And that's the thing. Like, we need to break this myth that it was created. Has there been people who abused the system? Yes. There's always that extreme or that's few cases. But for the majority of people, they need the help. And the other part of the myth is that it's no longer a myth, it's a reality, but people try to ignore. Majority of the people who use these benefits are white people, and most of them, I'm not saying percentage, but most of them are Republican who voted for the Republican Party, and they want to slash that. But it's okay for them to get benefits because they're not lazy. But if anyone else gets it, it's called lazy. So that's the problem we have. There's this big problem we have in this country, that if anybody who does not look white or conservative, they're already an enemy. And that's the problem. So with that, I would say this has been The Problem With, The Lies We Tell. Please follow us on Spotify, YouTube, and whatever you get your podcast. We have new episodes drop Mondays and Wednesdays of The Lies We Tell. And our deep dive series hit every Saturday, and we have the Off the Record where I react to the week's biggest news and talk where we go from there. And I hope you guys enjoy. Until next time, stay loud, stay honest, and never stop asking who the real villain is.